All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I know we have a lot to cover today. So thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Felicia Castaneda. I am the co-chair of the NCRA DEI committee, along with Julia Au, who's here as well. We have been doing some work in the background here to help get NCRA aligned with some of our DEI goals. And part of the things that we've been working on are ways that we can engage the NCRA community to help bring folks along on this journey with us. So we hosted one salon quite some time ago that focused on holding difficult conversations at work. So some of you may have been there. I think that was at some point last year. But we would love to start hosting these salons a little more frequently to just make sure that we're always continuing the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and helping our members sort of meet their needs for this work. So again, thank you all for joining us. The NCRA DEI committee was started a couple years ago, and we meet twice, or on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. And we are welcoming new members to our committee. So if you're interested in joining the committee, please reach out to either myself or to Julia. We meet just for half an hour to discuss our goals, and we have specific tasks that we're working on. Mainly, like I mentioned before, thinking about how we engage our members and putting on relevant and important events for you all. So again, please reach out to one of us if you are interested in joining. Today, we're very excited to have both Annie and Freddy here from the San Francisco Department of the Environment to review with us a new tool that they have developed called a racial equity scan. And this tool is used to help identify different issues and challenges and how they can be overcome when you're thinking about new programs. So it's a tool to help you look through new programs with the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're going to go ahead and walk us through sort of how this tool was developed, what it's used for, how we use it, and then we'll actually be working together to perform a racial equity scan on a made-up program. So you'll have a little bit of time to practice as well. So we do anticipate that this salon is going to be interactive. We're going to be using Jamboards, and we'll be using the chat. When we ask for feedback, you're also more than welcome to unmute and come on camera and share your comments or questions. We hope that folks are excited to engage, and we think that having this portion of the program where we're actually practicing using the tool will make it a little more relevant and allow folks to bring this back into their workplaces. So with that, I think I covered my intro as much as I could. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Annie and Freddy to kick us off.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can folks see my screen? All right, great. All right, go ahead, Freddy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Freddy Coronado, and I am the Residential Zero Waste Specialist at SF Environment, otherwise known as SFE. I'm also on the Northern California Recycling Association in the board. So I'm a board member, and I try to attend the NCRA DEI meetings. So my focus is mostly residential, so mandatory recycling composting, implementation of that ordinance, lately doing fix-it clinics and whatnot. So happy to share this tool with y'all, sorry. And yeah, it's our first time kind of doing an external presentation. So we hope that you join us on this as we learn how to share this with outside organizations.
Hi, folks. My name is Annie, and I am the City Government Zero Waste Assistant Coordinator at SF Environment. So I work with city departments and employees in San Francisco. And previously, I actually was the Environmental Justice Associate. So I was working with a lot of affordable housing sites in San Francisco. And both Freddie and I are rescue liaisons, so Racial Equity Steering Committee United members for our department. And that is why we're here today, to share more about what we're doing here at SFE and what resources you all can use too. All right, so I'm going to get started. So at San Francisco Department of Environment, our mission is to advance climate protection and enhance the quality of life for all San Franciscans. So through our environmental justice program, we spent nearly 2 decades working alongside low-income communities, trying to mitigate environmental burdens, increase accessibility of environmental programs, and improve the health outcomes of these communities. And although there's progress that has been made, there's still a long way to go. And we recognize the lack of diversity in the environmental movement. So in 2016, our department created a volunteer-led ad hoc equity, diversity, and inclusion working group to address it. And in 2018, our Commission of the Environment adopted a resolution codifying the department's commitment to racial equity and then formally announcing the Racial Equity Initiative. And then in 2019, the City and County of San Francisco's Board of Supervisors unanimously passed an ordinance to create the Office of Racial Equity. And part of the components of the Office of Racial Equity Legislative is to mandate city departments to create a racial equity action plan. And there's 2 phases to that plan. So the first phase really focuses more on internal programs and policies and workforce, including boards and commission. And then the second phase focuses more on procurement, contracts, grants, and external programs and programs in the community. So through the Racial Equity Action Plan, we created the Racial Equity Scan tool to really help us analyze our programs and really ensure that we're operationalizing racial equity into the work that we do. All right, so why are we focusing on race when there are so many different forms of marginalization? So our emphasis on racial equity is not to say that other forms of oppression are not important. We choose to lead with race because race is consistently a primary indicator of a person's life outcomes, including things like health, wealth, and overall well-being in society. Okay, so whether you're considering housing, education, employment, or environment, or any other institution, race is an indicator of people's life outcomes, even when you hold other factors constant. For example, 2 people with the same incomes and education levels, but different races, will experience very different life outcomes because of race. Also, racial inequities are deep and pervasive. There's also an intersectionality between race and other areas of marginalization. For example, a transgender person of color will experience greater disparities. So by focusing on race, we can develop specific strategies and bring people together to organize for change. And some of these strategies will also help address other forms of oppression. And we will have the tools, resources, and partnerships in place to take further steps in creating an equitable society. We see racial inequities in our environmental work. Environmental justice issues are concentrated in low-income communities of color, whether it's concentrated of contaminated land, outdoor, indoor air quality, or the location of polluting facilities. And of course, climate change has exacerbated these inequities, with low-income residents and people of color being hit hardest and having the least amount of resources to adapt. So what can we do to address these inequities? And now I'm going to turn it over to Freddie to talk about our framework. Freddie, you're muted.
Okay, unmuted. So I'm going to be covering our framework for change that addresses issues on several different levels. So this means investigating how existing policies and practices unintentionally support racial inequities and then change them. Next slide. So when we think about the framework for change, we can think about different types of biases. So, right, the most common that people think when talking about race is looking at the individual. So looking at personal prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. Next slide. Next is institutional, which means looking at policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentionally. Part of our initiative is to look at both internal and external policies and procedures through a racial equity lens. And last but not least, next slide, we have structural. So it's the history and cultural reality of institutional racism across all institutions, combining to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. So it is important to recognize and remember that none of this is because of one agency, one department, one city. It's just the fabric of our society and the history of it. This is a combination of decisions that over time have gotten us here. So each institution, whether it's, for example, a city or a holler or a nonprofit, each institution plays a role in creating this structure. And through our citywide or state or whatever other collective efforts, we will be able to find different strategies to chop away at the structure. So let's go to an example. So this example includes, for example, race and governmental policies. Of course, we have the history of redlining. And for us in zero waste, the siting of transfer stations, composting facilities, et cetera, in predominantly communities of color. Next slide. And I think all of us have heard maybe of Kettleman City versus Kettleman Hills landfill and the ongoing struggles of the community. So this is just another example of not only, let's not say like maybe individual racism, but more of a structural and institutional racism where one small city in the Central Valley of California, is pre-exposed to dangers from the expansion of Kettleman Hill Station. So you can see here, right, that the station is almost even bigger than the city itself. And we call it structural racism, environmental justice, because of the citizens that live in Kettleman City, for example. It's 80% people of color, over 90% don't know how to speak English. And of course, many of them don't have the ability to vote, therefore persuade their elected officials, for example, in Kings County, where Kettleman City is located at. So throughout its history, Kettleman City has been fighting racial discrimination at the structural and institutional level. We can do the next slide. So what is racial equity? So we've been talking about like racial inequality, environmental injustice, but what does racial equity actually look like, especially in our programs? Next slide. So racial equity just means closing the gaps so that one race does not predict one success and improve the outcomes for all. So in this case, one policy, one legislation will not only benefit white people, but it'll benefit everyone equally. And nobody will have the burden to implement the policy or program. Next slide. Okay, so I'd like to talk about the Curbside Effect. So sometimes we're focusing on those who are most marginalized. People with more privilege feel that something is being taken away from them and given to someone else when we try to fix something to bring equity, right? The part about improving outcomes for all is something I really would like to highlight. When you design systems for those who are most marginalized, it benefits everyone. Here's an example. So in 1972, passed by disabled activists, the city of Berkeley installed its first official curb cut at an intersection on Telegraph Avenue. Curb cuts were not an entirely new invention. They've been around, first appearing in Michigan, but the one on Telegraph changed the way the country thinks about access and opportunity for a population that has faced barriers at every turn. While the original curb cuts were created to serve people with disabilities, let's think about who uses curb cuts now. So you can feel free to put your answers on the chat, right? So who uses the curb cut now? and who benefits from it. And people with strollers, that's great. Yes. Bicyclists, yep, I definitely use the curb cut. We have to go on a sidewalk. Everyone, right? So next slide. So, yep, exactly. So at first it was designed for someone with a disability, perhaps in a wheelchair, but who benefits from this legislation is everyone. It's people on bicycles, maybe someone pulling a stroller, the paletero man, someone with their luggage, even people skateboarding and whatnot. Next slide. And what is the difference? So equality and equity are often used synonymously, but they're quite different when they have different meanings. So let's go over them. So inequality just means an equal access to opportunities. Next slide. Equality means people are treated fairly and in the same way. So, for example, San Francisco has a long-standing history of equal rights. The reality is that often those who already have resources end up getting more than they need. Therefore, we are shifting from equality to equity. Next slide. So, equity involves a recognition of structural privileges and prejudices. It is about recognizing that an equal playing field does not equal access the barriers or the specific needs of communities. Unfortunately, the reality is, more often than not, policies and programs do not benefit communities of color. You can do next slide. So we come to justice. Justice is about changing the system so that everyone benefits. The ultimate goal is removing the barriers for all. So we have a method of know where we're going and how to get there. And so this is where this tool comes in, our racial equity scan tool. So I'm going to hand it to Annie to get into detail about what racial equity tool is and how it combines all of those factors together.
Thanks, Freddy. All right, so what is a racial equity tool? And now we're going to put our lenses on so we can see differently. A racial equity tool is a guide to help people think about specific questions that will help them identify the potential for either perpetuating racial inequities versus advancing racial equity. And some of these questions in the tool include who will benefit from it, what are some barriers that might prevent someone from benefiting from it, who will be burdened by this decision, and what might be some unintended consequences. So when racial equity is not explicitly brought into operations and decisions, racial inequities are often perpetuated. And this is why we use a racial equity tool. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't change my own. All right. All right, so what is the racial equity tool process? We're going to go through each one. All right, so identifying existing initiatives and ongoing programs work at SF Environment with significant opportunities to advance racial equity. So at SF Environment, we actually use this tool to analyze our programs and policies. And these could be used for new programs, campaigns, or anything that's existing. So you can do this tool with your own team, or sometimes you can also invite other people from other teams to provide different perspectives. And overall, it's just a really great tool to do a program analysis. So we're going to go through each one, and just to let you know, it's really dependent on the program or policy that you're going to go through. We've gone through this tool in different program areas, and sometimes it can take 2 hours, sometimes it takes multiple sessions to go through every single step, and a lot of times it actually brings up a lot of more questions. All right, so the first step is desired results. What is your proposal and desired outcome? So we're really thinking about the impact. What is your overall goal of the program that you're trying to get results from? Then we look into the benefits and burdens analysis, so an analysis of data. What data do you need? What data do you have? Then we focus on the community engagement, who in the community and which others stakeholders need to be engaged. After that, we think about strategies for racial equity. So what are some potential strategies for advancing racial equity or helping to prevent unintended consequences? And once we kind of come up with the strategies, we really want to focus on the implementation plan. So how are we actually going to implement these strategies? What resources are needed? What additional data do we need? And then finally, communications and accountability. How would you evaluate and report back on the progress? And how do we make sure that we're keeping accountability of all these steps that we're doing? And then we're going to go through each one more in depth with a real example that happened at SF Environment. So in the city of San Francisco, we recognized that there was an issue with illegal dumping, especially around the multifamily and public housing areas. So our desired result was to reduce the illegal dumping in multifamily buildings and public housing areas. So we wanted to offer residents free and affordable service to get rid of bulky items such as furniture and old electronics. So next step is the analysis of the data. So when we're thinking about this, we need to think about who is this initiative intended to serve? What data do we have to identify these benefits and who is burdened? And this could include quantitative data and qualitative data. So we really want to think about who receive these benefits and who can be potentially harmed through unintended consequences when we make these decisions. So the data that we kind of realized that we had was we saw that there was a disparity in services offered in multifamily and public housing and versus the single family homeowners. And we also saw a disparity in abandoned waste. So after we kind of figured out what types of data we needed and what other, whether it's qualitative and quantitative, we really want to focus on the community engagement piece. So who is involved in the major decision making, and do certain stakeholder groups carry more influence or access than others? Why? Was community engagement conducted when this initiative was started? Why or why not? Was community engagement conducted on an ongoing basis? Why or why not? So for this example, we actually worked with property managers and tenants to make sure that we really understood what the barriers and challenges that they had. So we would actually go on site and talk to people to really get feedback and understand what was happening. And other things whereas when we're coming up with this idea is we really want to figure out with property managers where would residents actually place these items to get picked up. So we use the spectrum of community engagement to make sure that we're moving away from just informing people, letting them know about this program, and striving more towards consulting, involving, and collaborating so that the communities are integrated into the process and there is a partnership. We're actually having a conversation with them and making sure that we're building trust with the folks that we're working with. So after that, after doing the community engagement, we thought about the strategies for racial equity. So how might we remove the barriers for those who were unable to access the benefits? What community engagement strategies will we use to ensure that low income communities of color have more equitable influence or access? And what other tools or actions are available to achieve the strategies described above? So the strategy that we used to address this issue was we wanted to offer a free bulky item collection program for all San Francisco residents. So how this worked would be SFE would conduct a lot of focus outreach to these sites to make sure that they could benefit from this service. All right, now that we have a strategy, how do we implement them, right? What sources do we need? So how we started with the implementation was Recology had to change their policy. And SFE, what we had to do is we needed to make sure that we develop outreach materials to reflect the changes to let folks know that this was happening. Additionally, we created a multi-family mailer and it had beautiful artwork in the front, and we actually sent it all out to folks in San Francisco, to multi-family homes and apartments, so that they were aware of this free bulky item program. And we also made sure that the mailers were in Chinese and Spanish to make sure that we were meeting the language needs of residents. Lastly, we also provided more door-to-door outreach and technical assistance to residents, and also working with property managers to make sure that their systems were set up. All right, so after we are implementing our plan, we're going to focus on the communications and accountability, because it's important to receive feedback and check in to see how we're doing, what are other ways that we can improve. So how would you evaluate and report back on the progress towards making these desired outcomes? Is there a way to receive and incorporate feedback about the program? So for this example, after we implemented the bulky item pickup program, and after a couple of months, we went back and checked in with the property managers to really check in to see how effective the program was. We also worked with tenants to see if the program was actually easily accessible and what are ways that we can continue to improve the program. And we found out that after the bulky item collection service was rolled out, there was actually a measured uptick in bulky item collection. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Freddy, because we just did an overview of the racial equity tool on like a really high level scan, and then we're going to actually put you all into practice with an example.
I'm on mute again, sorry. Yeah, thanks Annie for that. I hope all of you were paying attention, because now we are doing a racial equity scan on an exercise legislation. So for this part of the session, we're gonna direct people, if you're able to join us on Jamboard. Let me get the link here. Please join us on Jamboard, as we all can do kind of inputs into it. Oh, I see people joining Jamboard now. That's great. Tool questions. Cool. Can you go to the next? Wait, hold on. Where did we put the? Okay, so for this exercise, Annie, if you can go to the next slide. Yes. So this is our Jamboard exercise, right? So this is what we're going to do our racial equity scan on. So the example that we've come up with is California is to mandate reusable foodware at food establishments. Oops.
Right.
At food establishments for dining customers. This mandate will impact food establishments with seating capacity, with those with seating capacity over 50 customers only. So I think it's an exercise that all of you can collaborate with, as there's a lot of foodware, reusable foodware legislation. So please join us on the Jamboard. Annie, can you go to that Jamboard? So when we go through our scan on this reusable foodware mandate for the state of California, so we're going to go through the questions. What is the desired outcome of this legislation? What data do we need to understand who benefits and who is burdened by a reusable foodware mandate? Which stakeholders are impacted? Which ones are engaged? What are some strategies for advancing racial equity? What is needed to implement the strategies? And how can we hold ourselves accountable? I think, yeah, next slide. So again, here's the exercise. California is to mandate reusable foodware at food establishments for dining customers. This mandate will impact food establishments with seating capacity over 50 customers only. So the outcomes, right, that we have is, of course, to reduce single-use foodware at food establishments, reduce waste generation, reduce disposal to landfill, reduce litter, increase jobs. If you have, if there's another outcome that any of you thinks that this legislation will provide, feel free to get a sticky note and put it on this tab. Because those are just the desired outcomes that can come in, but that I put in, but perhaps there's more that I missed. That should be out there.
And if folks have never used Jamboard before, so there's like a little control panel here. You could click on this icon with a little post-it, click on it, and then you could type whatever you want, like this. And then you could put your post-it note onto Jamboard.
Or you can also put it on the meeting chat and we'll add it to the Jamboard if you're not able to be in the Jamboard. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so our first step of a racial equity scan on this proposed legislation. So what data do we need to understand who benefits and who is burdened from a reusable foodware legislation in the state? So please add your sticky notes. There's obviously a really clear one here, who benefits and who is burdened. So feel free to add to the Jamboard. If you're not able to type, like, let us know. Yeah, so what data do we need? Who is to understand who benefits us? So let's see what we have here. What is the average upfront cost to make the transition to reusables? Very important. How many restaurants are impacted? Are there upfront switching costs? Restaurants. Let's see here. Added cost to customers, super important. Cost of purchasing reusables. Labor costs for cleaning soiled foodware. Let's see, what does this one say? What is the breakdown between restaurant sizes? How many employees, square footage, etc.? What is the demographics of the area? Yes, important. How many restaurants that would be subject to the regulation do not have dishwashing capabilities? So maybe let's put like, can we move these by, I'm curious if anyone has put who would benefit from this legislation. Chopstick exemption, nice. Cost of purchasing. So, right, it's as we go through this example, like things start coming up. It's not just, let's just reduce foodware, right? Like there's human factors that are associated by implementing this policy. So the cost is a huge barrier. We can see already, like there's a lot of data needed to see what is going to be the cost to understand who is burdened and benefit by this policy. Labor, it seems to be one as well. Operational costs, transition. So who benefits? That's a really good one. State goals, humanity, waste reduction, right? So Cal Recycle would likely benefit from this policy. Reduction in disposal costs. Okay. These are really great examples that everyone is providing here. Less plastic means less folks in frontline communities where they make plastic. Great point. People who live near landfills benefit from reduction in waste. Oops. All right, I think, so we have a pretty good understanding. I'm really glad of, the data that is needed and who benefits and who burdens. So if it's okay with y'all, we can migrate to the next slide.
Hey, Freddie,
Yeah,
can I just jump in really quick and see, maybe just pause and see if anyone has any questions around this first topic, or any clarifications or anything like that?
yeah, and feel free to unmute. And also this part of the exercise can be more, it can be more collaborative. Like, let's just work on this together. So feel free to unmute if you have any questions or comments.
And we had a couple comments in the chat that I don't know if they got put up on the Jamboard.
I'm putting them up on the Jamboard unless someone
perfect.
else is doing it. So
Thanks.
One of the barriers is to buy the reusables. There is a nonprofit called Plastic Free Restaurants that will purchase the reusables for you if they're replacing a single-use plastic item. So that's one of the barriers removed.
So the cost, maybe the availability of reusables. And I think, let's see if we put this one. Oh yeah, benefit, manufacturers of reusable foodware benefit. Yes. Okay, should we move on to our next question? All right, so who are the stakeholders that are impacted through a reusable foodware policy in the state? Which ones are engaged? So impacted, I'm just going to create a section here.
So like for when you're thinking about stakeholders, another question that I mentioned earlier is who amongst your stakeholders has more power and why, and who hasn't been involved and needs to be involved, and what maybe are some barriers from folks being engaged.
Oops. So producers impacted. So let's do impacted here. And let's do engaged. Let's do engaged over here. So do we think producers of reusables are impacted or engaged, or maybe both? I think it's both. Labor, back of the kitchen, definitely impacted. Right? Back of the house, workers, restaurant owners, managers, producers of reusables. I see that twice in here. Customers, diners, callers will certainly be engaged. Water utilities. Neighborhood cleanup works and or residents. Let's hope that they're engaged, not impacted. How do we know who will be engaged? How will engagement be measured? Kind of tapping into our first initial question. That's great. Language barriers, communication with the restaurant staff, restaurant suppliers impacted, nonprofits, suppliers. What about like restaurant associations or chamber of commerce? Um, those are typically stakeholders in reuse ordinances that hold more power than other groups. So let's make sure to add this on here as engaged. Water utilities. I'm going to just throw it in here, environmental org will family being overly engaged in this. Any more that we're missing? Regulators, space constraints. So let's see, space constraints. So maybe smaller restaurants will be impacted, EJ communities. Interns, regulators, producers of reusables, homeless population. Okay, I think, should we move on to the next slide? So when thinking about the reusable foodware policy, what are some strategies for advancing racial equity? So someone in the previous slide mentioned language barriers. So what would be a strategy to fix that barrier? So that would be this is a slide where one would put a solution for that. Ensuring outreach information in multiple languages, probably like step one. Making sure diversity of neighborhoods are reached out to. We have job analysis to ensure equitable compensation. Yes, kind of related to this one, wage of dishwashers / labor. Offer alternatives and affordable, accessible resources to restaurant owners and managers in multiple languages. Engage and partner with CBOs already involved in reusables. Building exemptions if reusable alternatives are not economically feasible or just don't exist yet. Oh, yes, this is a major one. Offer grant funding to make the transition, right? Put the money where you want the change to be at. Grants for buying foodware and dishwashers. Okay, I think we're getting to some stuff here. schools, adult education programs, religious orgs. I think it means to educate folks on this policy. We have exemptions for takeout, only restaurants for space constraints. Yes. Work with manufacturers who may allow for bulk discount orders across certain areas, groups. Differentiate one-time startup costs for transition versus ongoing operational costs. Contracting equity. Here we see chopstick exemption again. Opportunities to enter into, oh yeah, this. Okay, now on to question 5. Oh, let's see, there's some messages. We have publicized new businesses that collect and sanitize foodware. Is there one doing this? All right, moving on. So what is needed to implement these strategies that we just talked about? So let's think, yeah, dollar signs. That's a good one. What about who's gonna, like, let's think here, who's gonna do that outreach to those CBOs and to those communities of color, to those cultural districts? So, right, like hiring staff or training staff that looks and that can work with the community. Yeah, so community members, maybe hiring staff of color that can speak another language or that are from the community to build that community trust and relationship. Inclusive engagement tools, that's very interesting. That's quite interesting. So maybe, right, if you're going to have a community meeting to engage stakeholders, how would that meeting be like? Would it be in person? Would it be virtual? Would it be accessible with someone with a disability? Engagement tools. You need a rake chart, communication plan to internal, external customers. I'm curious, what is the RAIC? Trusted community members who speak the language, people can best reach those communities. Important to include translators, native reservations, Black Chamber of Commerce, immigrant communities. Absolutely. Work on case studies with few restaurants to create buy-in and trust in the restaurant community. That's important. An implementation plan, logistics and education. Reasonable time frame for compliance, absolutely. You can't just expect someone to comply with a law if they don't have the tools to comply. So that's very important. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, a website that connects suppliers with restaurants. Collaboration with public health departments to help inform restaurants of the change. That's a major strategy for sure. Identify respected individuals in the space to share their experience. And storage and money to buy reusables. That's true. How are we feeling? Should we move on to our last question of a racial equity scan tool? So, right, we've developed all these strategies to advance racial equity, to see who's benefits and who burdens. So how can we hold ourselves accountable and communicate progress on the strategies? It's probably a question that requires a little bit more thinking on like, how would you hold someone accountable that's doing racial equity work? Or Annie, do you have any suggestions for this one? It tends to be the hardest one for.
Yeah, this one is more challenging because a lot of times when we're implementing programs and policies where there's a challenge of not having enough time or capacity to go back and kind of reflect back on what changes can be made, what are things to improve on. So the example again for like the bulky item collection service was we had to make sure that we were going back months after to check in with the property managers to see how's it going. And a lot of times it might not be going as well as what we think it would be. So we might have to go back to the drawing board and kind of rethink or re-strategize what is a better solution. And I think that's something that we need to incorporate more into our programming and not just think that once we're done with a program, like that's it. There's always room for improvement. And I think it's really important to also incorporate feedback from the stakeholders. But again, we're trying to shift a little bit less from just getting feedback, but and really just involving them into the process and having them figure out and hearing from them what were the challenges from them even participating in the first place.
Yeah, very true. And I like this one of assessment of outcomes with a racial equity lens. So it can be something as simple as, how many businesses in this zip code, you can look at the disadvantaged communities map. I think it's from the EPA. And how many businesses in the zip code have made the switch versus how many businesses in a higher income or a more white zip code have made the switch.
Or if you're capturing feedback from folks, are there changes that are to be made, and then do we communicate back to the stakeholders, explain to them we heard you and these are the changes that we made to show that we're being accountable and we're hearing from them. And then another example is when we're doing a program, are there feedback opportunities? Are we just sending out a survey to hear from people, or are we actually meeting people at where they're at to hear from them? So there's a lot of different ways to keep ourselves accountable.
Yeah. We have here technical assistance. So yeah, someone put here SFE visits, regular site visits on site. So right, that's kind of how we measure often compliance, but also hearing what the needs of the community are. Setting aside funds and resources early knowing adjustments will be needed to be made later. Very true. And
I also think there's a huge importance of really, again, building that relationship and trust. Especially like, for example, when we were working with affordable housing sites, a lot of times it wasn't just like we worked with them one time and we're good. Like we would come back consistently to check in on them and again, build that relationship and, make sure that all their needs were being met.
so kind of like an ongoing relationship with restaurant / labor org. Meetings, relationship building, hire someone with DEI role for the organization and do an audit around DEI issues. That's a good start. Ongoing relationship with restaurant orgs, labor that work with communities of color, talk on ethnic radio and TV programs, and do call in. Stay with the community about the progress and go back to barriers to outcome. Well, this has been very, thank you all for being super engaged on this racial equity scan. And let me see if there's any else. So what we've gone through and these 6 questions is basically the skeleton, maybe like the backbone of what a racial equity scan is. So I hope that going through this exercise kind of gave you a better understanding of what a racial equity scan is. Of course, there are more detailed versions that go further into those questions. But simply by doing this, through your program or policy, even on your team, you open up an understanding that yes, we can put a policy, a program in place, but ultimately it affects a lot of people. And some people or some groups, some stakeholders have more power than others. And if we are to get to racial equity, we have to understand that we need to work with everyone and really, really, really engage the community, especially those that are burdened by the policy or who might be affected before like putting the hammer down on a legislation, hoping that things will figure out themselves. So in a way, SFE is doing that lately, like we're going a little bit backwards, right? Like let's not just pass a policy without the racial equity lens, because it results in further increasing racial inequality. Annie, do you have any other, let's see, are there any other slides on here?
Yeah, I think we want to hear from folks like what your thoughts and reflections are after doing the exercise. Was there anything that came up for you while you were going through this process? Were there questions that you never really considered? Or how would you utilize this tool in your own program areas? And, or, even you can also share what's a good takeaway that you want to start implementing using the racial equity tool. And you all can unmute or share in the chat what you all thought.
I'll go first. This is Nancy with Zero Waste Sonoma. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, actually, because we do have a number of programs that I don't believe really address the equity issue, and that's something that we need to improve on. So I found that this exercise was very helpful, and I really appreciate the development of this tool.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we've gone kind of through the same process here at SFE, and we're like, actually, this policy burdens people more than it benefits. It benefits the environment, it benefits our disposal, reduction goals, but it becomes a barrier and a burden to someone to implement. So thanks for sharing. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? Anyone working on this in your programs or policies?
So what if it burdens a local community that you might be working for directly, but actually helps a larger national community? I'm thinking about frontline folks who are like right next to the plastic producers, and like we would definitely be benefiting them. But like if it's like putting a on folks actually in SF around reusables, how do you kind of navigate that space?
Yeah, that's a good question and probably a really tough one to answer. The way that I've seen it, if the needs of the community are not met first, then they're not willing to change or to add another layer of burden on something like, for example, if you already have a restaurant that has dishwashers and yet they're gonna have to do more dishwashing, that's like more work for them or another thing to do. But perhaps the solution there is like, how can we work with the restaurant to increase the labor costs? I mean, the labor, a better living wage for that person, so that therefore they're willing to do the job or be more supportive of it.
Oftentimes when we're going through the scan, it brings up even more questions, and we can go down a rabbit hole of even more questions. And I think that's also really useful, again, because this tool is really for us to really start thinking about things that we haven't considered before. There are times when we can't answer those questions at the moment, but it helps us to identify what the next step is. And what we've kind of learned here is after we do the scan, we actually take a look at what are things that we could take actions on and what are things that we can't, and what changes can we make. I think that's like the important piece, rather than what Freddie was saying, just let existing programs and policies be the same without really reflecting back on, how is this actually affecting people? So it really starts a conversation. It starts like for us to think, and I think that's a really good starting place, but it does open up a lot of questions and challenges, and goes into even just like staff time and capacity and funding. And what we mentioned earlier on is these decisions, even though individually we're in the program area making it, but again, it really links back to the institutional and systematic structures on what we might need to address. So yeah, it is challenging. Sometimes we have to accept that we might not be able to solve everything, but it's better that we're having conversations and focusing on what are things that we can potentially do and address versus not doing anything at all.
I was wondering, Andy and Freddie, if you could talk a little bit more about like who in your organization is performing the equity scan, and like how do you decide who kind of sits in on that team to do the work?
Yeah, so I think because it's a requirement, so like all of the staff now have to do a racial equity scan on their policy and program, but it's always a collaborative effort of like bringing someone maybe from your team or from another team to have. Sometimes it's great to bring someone that doesn't work on the project that you're working on so that they can give you an outside perspective to it. But yeah, you're completely right. And also what Annie had said that, and something we forgot to put on the questions here is that staff is also burdened by implementing a scan tool. So it's, we're all burdened. It's an extra thing that we have to do on top of our regular work duties. But we do have, luckily, we have a new position. So we have a senior racial equity coordinator. So knowing that it was going to require staff time to implement the scans and policies and to assess, the outcomes and progress, like there had to be a new position created. So that's a new person. I think that will be starting soon. And then of course we have our racial equity sub coordinators. So Annie and I, for example, we're our rescue leads for our zero waste team. So if there's someone from our team that needs assistance with a racial equity scan, then Annie and I work together with that person to do the scan or to help answer questions. But yeah, it's definitely not a very easy, how do I explain this? I think a lot of the issues have stemmed out of people might not know what the impacts themselves are on the communities or not be from that community. So therefore you can't really answer some of the questions. So I think that there's a lot of importance to bring someone from the community when doing a racial equity scan on a policy program, or someone that works with that. Annie, do you want to add?
Yeah, and I think it's really important when we're doing the racial equity scan that we don't want it to just be another like checkbox, like, oh, we're completing it because we have to. But again, like, what are the benefits of doing this scan to improve, the work that we're doing? And Freddie mentioned like we help our respective teams, but there are opportunities sometimes when we help other program areas. Like for example, like we have a toxics reduction team, and so it's a good opportunity to also understand like what other folks are working on and give perspective, because sometimes we're in our own bubbles and we can go on and on about things, but when you bring in somebody new who might not know about the program and you kind of explain to them, they might ask different questions that you never thought of. And I think in terms of best practices, you can really approach doing the scan in different ways. But I think it's helpful when the folks who are most knowledgeable about that program or policy, they would first complete the scan and answer those like initial questions first. And then you can have someone else come in and go through the questions more and kind of ask for further detail, because a lot of times in the beginning, we're really focusing on describing what the program is. And we want to really get into those questions of identifying like who has been missing out on the conversations, or what are these challenges and what can we work on them. So it's something that takes practice and it does take time, but I feel like everyone who's done it is like, oh, this was really helpful and useful. So yeah.
Hi, I had a quick question about the equity scan. I was wondering, how does program efficiency factor into the scan? Like, I could imagine identifying all the burdens and benefits and sort of it being very tempting to try and address each and every one of the burdens. But at what point, like, how do you prioritize, I guess, the burdens? And at what point does it become too I guess like thinking about program efficiency, when does trying to address every single burden become overwhelming for just that program to achieve, if that makes sense?
Yeah,
Um, Go ahead, Annie.
no, go ahead, Freddie. We're trying to figure that out ourselves too. I think we try to address like the low hanging fruit as much as we can. But it's really figuring out, again, it's like the curbside effect, right? Like what are things that we can address that could potentially solve multiple problems? But also again balancing out like, okay, which ones are the low hanging fruits that we can address at the moment? And it's really looking back into your team and your program area, like how much time, resources can you do you have to address those problems? But we're still figuring out ourselves too.
Mhm. And I would say, I mean, more often than not, right? Like someone that might be working for a community that doesn't have resources itself, like might be even harder to do this because you might have multiple tasks to do, and on top of that, you work in a community that is disadvantaged. So, but I think the beauty of the racial equity scan and going through these questions is that it really, like, if you're trying to get people in your city or your community to like understand your policy or program or to support it, like the time going through this is necessary. Especially if you live in a community that, you know, might be of lower income or community of color. Because otherwise you're just not, it's gonna be the same. You're not gonna be able to implement because no one is complying or no one has the resources and tools to understand or to implement the policy. So yeah, basically one shoe size does not fit all in going through this process.
Thanks. And yeah, I know it's a difficult question to grapple with, but I appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Steven, I see that you asked the question, is there discussion of going to the highest level of community engagement, deference to communities' needs and wants? There is. And I think the challenge that we're really thinking about is when we're talking about community engagement is really how do we make sure that we're also fairly compensating people for their time and energy, their knowledge and thoughts. Yeah, that's something we're trying to focus more on, because a lot of times we're asking people, let's do a focus group, let's ask them for their opinions, but at the same time, we need to make sure that they're fairly compensated and acknowledge that they are the experts, because these folks who are, most proximate to the problems are the ones who let us know, what the solutions are. Yeah, so that's something we're considering too, and thinking about what does that even look like. I think at the moment that's like the goal that we want to strive towards. But at the moment we're trying to steer away a little bit more from just informing people and really actually consulting and collaborating with them. But it's hard because of, again, time and capacity. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more other questions or comments, on the next slide, oh, we don't have our emails. I'll put my email in the chat. We will likely send a follow-up email. We have to, yeah, maybe with a slimmed down version of the questions that we just went over, just so you can use them. But I'm typing my email in the chat if you have any other further questions. But yeah, thanks on joining us on the racial equity scan tool. Again, it's something fairly new to our department. So we're all kind of going through this process together.
Yeah, and I think we would love to hear from you all too, if you do implement it in your organizations. What are good takeaways? I think it's important for us to learn from each other. There's, not one right way to do this. And so if you all have any of the solutions, I think this is a great space to really share that information, and for us to kind of really be thought partners and really doing this work. And I think starting within your own team is a great start. So yeah, thank you everyone for participating and joining.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. It was really wonderful to get everyone's input. If you have any feedback on this sort of event or salon in general, feel free to send out an email, again, to either me or Julia. Or if you have any thoughts or ideas about content or presentations or events that you would like to see in the future relating to these topics, please feel free to let us know as well. And
Yeah,
thank
you can
so
leave
much.
a comment on the NCRA website in the contact us. Just leave a message and we'll get it. So yeah. But thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much to Freddie and Annie for an awesome presentation. That was really informative. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was so great.
Thank you all. And yeah, I can't wait to hear more about your, how do we achieve racial equity in our industry? It's very needed.
And we got to really give shout outs to our racial equity leaders, Soko and Shraddha.
Yeah.
They were really the
Yes.
ones like pushing this forward. So
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.